Welcome, Meisner makers. It is Wednesday. It is 1 o'clock. It is time for this week's edition of Wednesday Workshop at 1. So what I want to share with you today is what I think is multiple things. I want to share with you what I think is a pretty versatile Accuquilt Go die. I want to share with you some thoughts on how you can create this in several different ways or several different variations, but also give you some hints and tips for working with your cutter as well as accurately and precisely piecing. Ooh, that was a mouthful. So where I want to start is with cutting. Anytime that you are creating any type of a project, but in particular when you are piecing for quilt making, the more precise and the more accurate your cutting is to start with, the more easily your quilt blocks will go together, especially those that have a lot of pieces or small pieces involved. Then the more perfect those blocks are going to be and closer to the correct finished size, so that the entirety, as you build that quilt, the entirety of the project is going to go together a lot more smoothly and a lot more effortlessly for you. So there are a lot of ways to cut using rotary cutters and acrylic rulers, but what I want to talk about first is cutting with, or today is cutting with the Accuquilt. So the Accuquilt system, if you've not seen them before, they work with a series of dies. Now here's an example of an applique die. There are shape dies, block dies, applique dies, and on the die itself, it's a foam pad with blades embedded into the foam. When your fabric is positioned over those blades and covered with a mat, they're then run through the Accuquilt system, and this is what's going to cut your fabric perfectly and accurately each time. So this is really a nice time saver, number one, because you are far faster when you're cutting through this way than when we're cutting the traditional rotary cutting method, but it's also more accurate as well. Another nice thing that Accuquilt has done is when there are blocks or there are pieces where you would have what are known as dog ears or little edges that you would cut off after stitching the pieces together, like we do with half square triangles, for example. On the Accuquilt dies, they've already clipped those out for you. So it saves you from having to go back and reclip them, but it also makes it easier to align the edges of your fabrics together when you're joining unusual shapes. So that's kind of a nice thing to know about these dies as well. So in today's project or today's block, we're going to be stitching this wonky heart block that we see here on this pillow. Now before you say, oh my goodness, it's a pillow, if you take the pillow form out, you'll see that it's a 9-patch variation. It also would be kind of really fun with the pillow form removed to use as a tic-tac-toe board, right? So a quick place to have a family game night, or if you have the grandkids over to visit, they can play tic-tac-toe with giant buttons out of your stash and the flattened out piece. Also, without the pillow form in, when it's left down flat, if you just create it as a small quilt top or little mini quilt, it's a great wall hanging piece. It's also a nice table centered type of a piece. So if you're decorating for a holiday, you have people over for dinner, you can use that as almost like a trivet on the table or on the countertop. So lots of different ways you can use it. And of course, you could create an entire quilt with this wonky heart block. So that's what we're going to do today, is we are going to create the wonky heart block. So bare minimum, what do we need for this particular piece? We need the wonky heart die from Accuquilt. It does fit or work with the manual cutter and also the electric cutter. Whenever you're looking at your Accuquilt dies, there is a little cheat sheet on here, and it will tell you down at the bottom which one of the Accuquilt cutters this particular die is compatible with. So that's an important thing to check to make sure that when you get home you have a die that's going to fit your die cutter. All right, cameraman Joe, are we ready to cut a wonky heart and stitch one up?
Yeah, let's cut it up.
Okay. The The wonky heart is what's known as a block on a board. And what that means is all of the pieces for your block are all together on one board. Couple of tips, hints, etc. Notice that it looks like our block is on our board at an angle. That's done so that the fabric will feed best through the Accuquilt cutter. Okay, so that was done intentionally. When I lay my fabric on my board, I want the cut edges or the grain lines to be running parallel to the straight edges of the block, not the straight edges of the board. Okay, that's going to give you the best cut. Now with this particular block, there's a lot going on, and I find that it was good practice to give my fabric a little extra stiffness by spraying it ahead of time with Best Press and giving it a good pressing so that it has a little bit of crispness to it. I'm wanting to get rid of any static that may be between the layers of the fabric and make them nice and crispy, because these are some wonky kinds of shapes that we have going on here. Now this particular block shape also works really well with any of those pre-cuts that you might have at home, because that's going to save you some time as well. You just take your pre-cuts out, remember lay them down parallel to the block edges, not the die edges, so they go in about like so, and then feed through the machine. Now obviously we're not going to send the entire package of 10-inch squares through all at once. We would send about 6 through at a time. Now this particular, when we're working on block on board, the other thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is placing all of your fabrics in the same direction, meaning everything needs to be right sides up or everything needs to be right sides down. This is not a symmetrical thing, right? If you place your first layer with the right sides up and the next one with the right sides down, then your pieces aren't going to join. If we look at the image here on the front of the wonky heart, part of the fabric we're cutting is for the heart shape, part of the fabric is for the background. For each pass of the cutter, you're cutting a background and a heart of the same color. So we're going to shuffle that deck once we get our fabrics cut. Now, if that sounds confusing, have no fear. We're going to walk through the whole process. So the first thing that we would do is either A, grab our 10-inch pre-cut fabrics, best press them, and then press them with the iron so they're nice and crispy. Or we're going to go to our fabric stash and we're going to grab some fabrics that are at least large enough to cover our block on board. We're going to position them right sides up, both of them right sides up, so that when we get ready to sew all of the pieces together, they've all been cut and are positioned the same way. It's very easy to make that error. Ask me how I know. Now we could do up to 6 layers at a time, but for today's example, we're just going to send 2 layers through. And when you're creating a new block like this, I find that it's good practice also to cut a couple of test colorways to make sure that that is the color, that those are the colors that you're going to be happy with on your finished project. So our fabrics are covering up the pieces. I have those raw edges roughly aligned with the cutting blades. I'm going to position my mat over the die, covering the fabric and encasing the blades and the fabric between the mat. And then we're just going to roll it right through our cutter. Now we could be doing this with the electronic cutter as well. I'm going to use the manual cutter for today. Once we have run this through, we would then remove the mat carefully because we don't want that static to peel our fabric pieces up. All right, so that mat's removed. And you can see things shifted just a little bit, but that's going to happen. Now, what I would recommend is before you move anything else, we're going to carefully remove the excess fabric, making sure our little pieces stay in place on our board. This is going to just make life easier for you when you get ready to sew these pieces together. Okay, and then I would remove the red fabric as well. Okay, so we're going to continue removing the excess. And now we have our pieces on our board and we're ready to go to the machine and put them together. All right, so for each fabric layer that we've cut, we have a background and we have the heart shape itself. So here's a finished one for you to get a little bit of a visual. All right, so for the two layers that are together, I'm going to have one where fabric A is the dominant heart. And out of that same pass of two fabrics, where fabric B is the dominant part of the heart. So before we start sewing, we want to rearrange these. Now this one's going to be very simple because we just have two layers of fabric. If I were doing this at home and cutting 4 to 6 layers at a time, I would remove each stack and set them next to the die in the same order that they appear on my die, just to make life easy. But here we've got just 2, so I'm going to flip, I'm going to pull the bottom layer to the top, bottom layer to the top, and I'm doing this just for the shapes that are around the perimeter of the die, because that's what will form the background. Okay, the 3 centermost pieces are the components that form the heart shape. Okay, so we can almost sort of see something coming together. Do you see that heart there in the middle, Joel?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so now how do we stitch this together? If you go to the Accuquilt website, there is a stitching tutorial, but if we kind of take the pieces and we look at them and go, okay, where are the straight edges that we're going to want to sew? This is a strip, this is a unit, this is a unit. This will finish this unit off, and then that grouping will stitch to this grouping, will stitch to this grouping. So if that sounded a little confusing, here's one in place underneath. So this area that we're going to join becomes this unit. Okay, the center portion where we join these 4 individual pieces becomes this unit. Up at the top where we have these 3 segments will become this unit, and then when we attach this final piece, it finishes off the unit. From here, we would join these 2 segments together and these 2 segments together to create the finished block. Shall we stitch one of those together, cameraman Joel?
Yeah, it sounds easy.
All right. Now when we're stitching this wonky heart, it got its name because the shape is kind of wonky. So the first 2 pieces that we're sewing together are piece D and E from your block on a board. And you can see that it is just a very unusual shape. So thanks to the unique cutting on the Accuquilt die, I know exactly where to position piece D on top of piece E. So I want these straight edges together. This little point right here shows me where that 1/4 inch seam allowance is, so I know that my stitching, it gives me a reference line for my stitching. And then at the top, I want the points to match. I'm using a 1/4 inch presser foot on my machine and just a thread that will blend. Stitch to the end. Oh, right on that point. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and cut and remove. Now you could chain piece, but I would do my first couple of blocks using a traditional method of stitching a segment at a time until you get accustomed to how this block goes together. So here's that first piece where we've joined D and E. I'm going to put them back on my board so I don't lose track of where they live. From the board, I'm going to take pieces F and I, and let's stitch those together. Again, wonky shapes, but our cutter has given us clues as to how they should be positioned. Go right underneath that presser foot. 1/4 inch seam allowance. Stitch, 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 and clip. All right, next we're going to take pieces F and I, position them under the presser foot, line up those edges, those points, and stitch. Okay, I'm going to be brave on this one, and the two pieces for the remainder of that segment are pieces J and C. They live right next to each other on the board, and they're going to join up to the pieces that we've just stitched together. If you begin to align your pieces and something seems off, where the edges are really just not the same size or even close, make sure that nothing has shifted on your board or that you haven't turned one of the pieces around. So that can happen very easily on these odd shaped pieces. So we're going to clip that open, making sure at my board once again that I'm laying my pieces down in the right order. And then we will join that section together. Return it to the board. Now we're at that top section, pieces G and H. Okay, something shifted. Double check my layout here on my board. Well, something didn't shift. I moved something. Your fabrics will not move in and of themselves. So we're going to complete this process with each of the sections on our block. Now you have your 3 segments like the ones we see here in the illustration. And typically what I'll do is I wait till I get to this point and then I'll press the seams. There aren't a lot of places where you're going to have joins that intersect, so it's not such a big deal which way they're going. But you do have this one edge here in the corner, and I do want one seam to be pressed up and the other seam to be pressed back, so that when I lay these one on top of the other to join the segments, those 2 little seam allowances are going to lock in place and keep the fabrics from shifting, so that when the block is finished, it'll match up and align nice and crisply here at the points. Right? I just find that works a little bit better for the intersections. So we'll stitch these 2 segments together, flip it open, these 2 segments together, flip it open. We'll then press our block and it's done. Then the remaining pieces that you have on the board, you will stitch the same way, and it will give you that colored mirror image of the first block. Isn't that just a cool way to be able to stitch up some fun and unusual blocks very quickly and very easily? So I hope that you enjoyed walking through that wonky heart block as much as I enjoyed making them. And in fact, I think now that we sign off from today's Wednesday workshop at 1, I'm going to just sit back here and cut up this great cotton shot 10-inch square bundle that just came in. and make up a few more of these quilt blocks. So we'll see you next week. As always, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or recommendations for future workshop topics, shoot us an email at info@meisnersewing.com. Have a great week.